Termo to Madeline, Audio Edition, page 144, chapter titled The Legend Lawless and Other Divisions. Early day pioneers at Madeline had fun, real fun, and lots of it. A group of people together in the same house, a fiddler, a guitar, or maybe a piano or an organ, and someone who could play one of them was cause for a dance. Every stage and freight stop on every route generally had one or more of these instruments. Now, then, whenever somebody showed up on one of these stages or freight outfits who knew how to play, a dance was on, and it often did not let up until well after midnight. Pianos were a real luxury in the early years, but after the arrival of the NCO, a few people started to get them. Wilson and May Bailey were the first proud owners of a piano. Elmer and Ollie Van Loan were next. Then two young ladies, Eva Kingsbury and Carrie Johnson, each received a piano for their birthday. Mrs. Pino was an expert on the piano and organ and gave the two girls piano lessons along with other interested youths. Dances were not always impromptu. Many times they were planned and organized well in advance. They were held at people's homes in the Madeline Hotel or at the new Madeline Schoolhouse, which was completed in the early spring of 1903. Now, Harvey Williams or Bob Singler generally played the fiddle, Art Smith and Mrs. Brasher played the guitar, Mary Pino and others played the piano. There was usually always someone who could call square dances. William Maurer was well known for being the best square dancer in the country, and his son Ross ran a close second. At the dances, there were usually a cakewalk, done to the music of a snappy quadrille. Other activities that kept everyone happy were varied. Boating on Wilson Bailey's Reservoir in the summers was enjoyed by many of the young people. In the winter, they ice skated. In those early years at Madeline, there were about as many young people in the vicinity of Van Loan's as there were at Madeline. It was not uncommon for a crowd of people to borrow a hand car from the NCO and run down to Van Loan's for a day of skating on the reservoir. And speaking of ice, Elmer Van Loan and Wilson Bailey both harvested large ice crops off of the reservoirs in the winter. It was stored in large blocks in their ice houses for the future use in the summer. The Madeliners always held a big 4th of July celebration, and ice cream was always on the main attraction, thanks to Wilson and Elmer's ice houses. One of the great entertainments of the day was the Drama and Literary Club. It was organized on May of 1903 and went strong for the next 5 or 6 years. It was called the Langalala's Club, and it met every first and third Saturday of the month. They put on plays, read poetry, sang and played musical instruments, and debated current topics of the day. These included such things as resolved that the state constitution should be amended to change the meeting of the legislature to February and prolong the session 20 days, and resolved that the Academy of Science should not be taxed. Both of these topics were decided in the affirmative. The initial driving force behind the Langalalas was one of the all-time great educators of the area, Lawrence Wilson. He taught at Madeline and in his native Big Valley for many years and was loved and appreciated by all of his students. The students at Madeline achieved greater excellence under Lawrence Wilson than probably any other teacher in the 80 years the school existed. He left Madeline in 1906 to attend the University of California at Berkeley. Then he obtained his credential for educating teachers and spent the next many years operating a school by teachers in Big Valley. It was there that Bertha Whittinger obtained her education in 1907, and after taking the teacher's examination at the high school in Susanville, she was awarded her license to teach. When Lawrence Wilson left Madeline, his sister, Mrs. Nettie B. Harris, another all-time great teacher, came to teach. It was under her guiding hand that the Langalalas continued to excel in performance. Mr. Wilson was the first president of the club, and over the years other officers included Nettie B. Harris, Ollie Van Loan, Mrs. Mary Pino, Bertha Smith, Art Smith, Eppa Kaufman, Tom Smith, and Jesse Van Loan. Molly Brockman was in charge of refreshments most of the time the club existed and assigned what would be brought by the various families. She and the other ladies also had an embroidery and thimble club operating at the same time. The Langalallas charged admission to their programs, and the proceeds went to buy school materials. The Madeline School was furnished with desks and chairs by the Langalallas, and a brand new organ was furnished soon after it was built. People came from all over the country to their performances, including Alturas, Likely, Ayden, Bieber, Eagleville, Reno, and others. The night of their first performance, June 26, 1903, saw 100 guests accommodated at the Hotel Madeline. The club cleared $109 above their expenses that night, and that is what bought the new organ for the new school. Some of the numbers that night included an instrumental duet by Mrs. Hall and Eppa Williams, with Seville Hall accompanying them, beating time with the sleigh bells. Miss Lucia Russell, daughter of Dick and Lucia Russell, sang a very pleasant solo. A play titled The Infernal Machine, by 6 of the young people of Madeline, brought down the house. There was generally always a dance after one of the performances, and the ladies never missed providing mouth-watering refreshments to their socials. The program always varied, but had a variety of acts. The following, from January 30th, 1907, is representative. It's a schedule of events. There was a chorus, Our Old Bobsled, by School Duct, The Gypsy Cortez, by Mary Peno and Ray Stinson. There was a dialogue titled The New Suit, by Freda Beverly Lilly, Van Loan, Helen Peno, Jesse Van Loan, Oscar Peno, and Earl Smith. Then there was a solo titled I've a Longing for You, by Ruby Van Loan. There was a burlesque and college song by 4 young people. There was a solo by Heart's Flowers, by Mary Peno, Bertha Smith, etc. Then there was a reading time, select reading, titled The Swing, by Mrs. Harris. And there was a solo, My Mama's Waiting There, by Helen Peno. Then there was a chorus, a laughing song by School. There was a tableau titled Temptation, by Eva Kingsbury, Bertha and Tom Smith. And there was a tableau titled Saved, by Mary Peno, Helen Peno, Evan Kingsbury, Bertha Smith, Little Van Loan, Ruby Van Loan, and Art Smith. Okay, probably one of the finest comedies put on by the Langalallas was a minstrel performed on the evening of April 1st, 1904. It was a production that brought a huge audience to the Madeline from the surrounding communities. Now, the program was given at the school, something that could never have happened this day and age due to the prejudicial and discriminating nature of the performance. Handbills were passed around town and sent to newspapers of the area to advertise the play of mouth in advance. There's a small script here that reads, quote, Minstrel boys are busy at work preparing for April 1st at Madeline. The public is invited, and everyone here anticipates the success of the season. The minstrel has enrolled the finest-looking company of coons ever seen in Northern California. Don't miss the minstrel, unquote. The Madeline correspondent with the Lassen Advocate described the performance as it took place that evening. They wrote in their paper, quote, The coons conducted their minstrel admirably, and to the glory of themselves and the pleasure of the audience, where it was not for their ebony faces, I should say those taking part in the performance were L. A. Wilson, N. A. Hall, Greg Skeckelford, Harvey Williams, Webb and Ellen Peno, Herb and Jesse Van Loan, Barney Kingsbury, Grover Smith, and Ray Stinson. It being the first efforts of the company was appreciated by all who saw it, and a special feature of the evening was the excellent ragtime dancing of Greg Skeckelford, titled Old Black Joe. It was an evidence that was greeted with applause. The lecture given to the ladies in the hall by a cultured colored young lady, Mrs. Snowball. She brought down the house. Mr. Cleveland was L. A. Wilson. He also gave a humorous description of his trails as a Benedict, which was warmly received. The finale was a cakewalk quadrille in which 4 colored girls took part. The boys were bubbling over with good humor, and that being infectious was caught by the audience. A social dance followed at the hotel and lasted until morning. Coffee, sandwiches, and a cake were served at midnight." Unquote. The Langalalas, whether singing, reading, performing, comedies, or debating the topics of the day, are now only a memory. But for a while they brought literary and dramatic excellence to the town of Madeline. They, above all, brought fine entertainment and some of the greatest enjoyment the area had ever seen. Next chapter, titled William Maurer and Art Smith, the Village Blacksmiths. As important to the settlement of the West as the stage operators, the railroaders, and the freighters were the local blacksmiths. Without them, everything would have shut down. All of the ranchers on the Madeline Plains were, of course, non-professional blacksmiths out of necessity. They had horses to shoe, wagons to mend, and farming and haying equipment to keep operational. Some of the bigger outfits had their own blacksmiths. For example, William Brockman kept everything working on all the Brockman ranches around the county. But there were those who made their livings from blacksmithing. They were superb at their profession. They knew the exact temperatures, which in those days was determined strictly by the color of the heated metal. To the temper metal for the varying hardnesses, they could corrective shoe a horse with any kind of foot or leg trouble. They could sharpen or repair any kind of farm tool over their forges. And they, generally, were all wagon makers, which meant that not only could they forge the metal parts, but they were carpenters too, building the wooden structures as well. The two main blacksmiths on the west side of the plains at the turn of the century were William Maurer and Art Smith. Bill Maurer had been around the country doing all the area's complicated blacksmithing for a long time. He had spent those years away from Madeline at Dobbins in Yuba County, California, from 1898 until 1903. But at the end of that time, he came back and set up shop in the new blacksmith shop in Madeline. He built a house right behind the shop, where he and his wife lived for the next 3 years. The only difference in blacksmithing at the town of Madeline from blacksmithing at the Van Loan stage station in the early days was the amount of work. With the railhead right beside his shop, Mr. Maurer's work was multiplied greatly. In fact, he and Mrs. Maurer came back for him to take over the operation of the large Madeline blacksmith shop in May of 1902, and by April 1903 he had to build an extension on the building in order to keep up with the work coming in. And he had to hire extra help. David Meikle, the main carpenter in the building of the hotel, livery barns, and other buildings around Madeline, was a blacksmith and spent a lot of hours helping out at the shop. The other main blacksmith of Madeline in 1903, besides Mr. Maurer and Art Smith, the 32-year-old son of John and Pamela Smith. The amount of work to be done kept these three men and others on the move constantly. Wagon tires, spokes, and felloes were always loosening and breaking on the wheels of many freight wagons and stage coaches, as well as spring wagons, buckboards, and buggies that came over the rocky country to Madeline. Metal parts on the bodies, axles, and running gears of all the wagons cracked, bent, and broke over extensive use. Rings, hames, buckles, and chains on the harnesses had to be repaired. Plowshares were brought in by the local farmers for sharpening and building up, and other farming and haying equipment was always in need of repair. Welding was done daily by heating metals to the right temperature and then pounding the two pieces together while using a borax flux to keep the metal clean. These blacksmiths were experts at molding whatever shape was needed with a hammer and an anvil. The NCO even brought in metal parts and pieces for welding, shaping, and repairing. And of course, there was always the job that the men had the least liking for, the strenuous, difficult job of shoeing horses. Like the iron tires on the wagon wheels, horseshoes were continually loosening and falling off. Art and Bill sometimes charged as much as 50 cents for an hour worth of work. They did not get rich, but they made a good living, and it was a good trade to be in. On a long day, they could make as much as $5 to $6, whereas the everyday ranch hand usually made $1 a day and never topped $2. The Mowers had left the Madeline Plains back in 1898 because of Belly's health. It did not improve in Yuba County, but moving back to Madeline did not help either. Poor Bella Mower was in an almost constant state of illness from the time they arrived back on the plains. She died in February 1905 and was buried in Susanville. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Mower quit the blacksmith shop in Madeline and moved back out to Van Loan's. Art Smith moved into their house and continued to operate the blacksmith shop until 1909. Next chapter, titled Roy and Harvey Williams, Horse Buyers, page 151.